The first time the human fleet appeared on the horizon, the alien queen had been sipping her morning nectar, a luminescent fluid that changed flavor depending on her mood, and she nearly spat it across the council chamber in surprise. The fleet glinted like a swarm of metal insects against Valian skies, engines humming a low, impatient thrum that vibrated through the floating spires. Her advisors, all nervously adjusting their robes and cranial ornaments, began whispering about war protocols, defensive arrays, and interstellar treaties that no one had read since the last century. She raised an eyebrow, long ears twitching like antennas catching a particularly juicy signal. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth as melted crystal, "I think we have company, and not the polite kind that brings gifts." Captain Elias Drake, of the human fleet, was sitting in his command chair trying to figure out why the holographic map of the Valian capital kept wobbling like a drunk star. His crew swore it was a software glitch, but he suspected it was an unintentional display of alien humor. He'd read somewhere that Valians delighted in watching humans flail in confusion. Elias had a reputation for being cocky, which usually meant that the aliens assumed he was a threat until he tripped over a console and accidentally fired a warning flare. Today, that flare would be his introduction to the alien queen herself. The queen watched him from her observation window, perched above the council chamber, where no human eye could reach without a telescope the size of a moon. She didn't often get amusement from visiting armies, but there was something about the human's awkward posture, the way he jabbed at buttons with exaggerated precision, that made her lips twitch. She leaned closer, her elongated ears shifting forward in a gesture she sometimes used when she wanted to listen carefully or spy on someone. Elias, of course, had no idea he was being scrutinized in real time by the most dangerous woman in the sector. He thought the twitching of the spires outside was merely atmospheric interference. The first meeting was set in a room that had been designed to confuse intruders. The floors floated slightly above the ground, shifting patterns as if they had a mind of their own, and the walls occasionally projected images of past rulers that winked at guests, though no one admitted to noticing. Elias, attempting diplomacy, extended his hand toward the queen, who regarded it with the kind of calculation that made entire planets quake. "Greetings," he said. "I come in peace mostly." The queen's ears twitched. "Mostly?" she asked, her voice glinting with curiosity. "Do humans find honesty optional?" Elias smiled, thinking that she would not understand the concept of subtle sarcasm, but perhaps she did because her eyes briefly flickered with silver amusement. He didn't know it, but that flicker was the first thread tying their destinies together. Diplomacy quickly turned into a display of absurdities. A translator droid, shaped suspiciously like a rubber chicken, insisted on interpreting every word literally. When Elias said, "We come with open arms," the droid translated it as, "We arrive with extended limbs for hugging purposes," which made the queen's advisors snicker behind her throne. She, however, suppressed a laugh so well that her ears shivered involuntarily, betraying her composure. The humans, unaware of the breach, went on to compliment the architecture of the floating spires in a manner that sounded like praise but was interpreted as critique. One human, attempting humor, asked if the spires ever collided, and the queen almost rolled her eyes, imagining centuries of her ancestors' patience evaporating into the cosmic void. Yet she couldn't help but find herself entertained. There was a charm to these creatures, an audacious confidence wrapped in awkwardness. After hours of verbal fencing, debates over trade agreements, and near disasters with holographic dinner platters that levitated away mid-bite, the queen decided to indulge in a private observation of Elias. She slipped through a hidden corridor to the observation deck, a place where the city and sky merged into a swirl of colors that humans could not name. Elias was pacing, muttering to himself, his movements jerky but deliberate. "Do they always have such energy?" he asked his second-in-command. "I think it's their version of manners," the officer replied, ducking as a floating orb nearly knocked over a console. The queen's ears twitched again. Curiosity piqued. She leaned closer to the transparent barrier and made a note in her mind that this human had a tendency to survive chaos with a sort of panicked charm that was undeniably magnetic. Meanwhile, her court continued to chatter in low tones, trying to decode human behavior while preparing for the worst. There were murmurs of sabotage, covert attacks, and daring rescues that might never happen, all happening while Elias attempted to apologize for accidentally activating the building's anti-gravity chamber, sending a perfectly ordinary diplomat floating into the ceiling. The queen's lips twitched again. Humor, she decided, was a more useful tool than war in certain circumstances. At least, it kept her entertained while the human continued to stumble toward her attention without realizing the danger of his own magnetism. By the time night, or whatever approximated night in a city that floated above a sunlit abyss, fell across the Valian capital, both the human and the queen were exhausted in different ways. Elias, convinced he had survived first contact with a hostile alien race, sat down for a meal that refused to stop levitating, muttering curses under his breath. The queen, pacing in her chambers, found herself replaying his awkward smiles and irreverent comments. She scolded herself for thinking about him more than her advisors, for laughing at things she had sworn were beneath her attention, and for considering that perhaps, against every logical strategy, she wanted to see more of him. Her ears flicked in frustration. Emotion, she realized, was far more complicated than any battle plan. When she finally allowed herself a moment of quiet, the queen stood by her window, watching the human fleet shimmer in the distance. She considered issuing orders to advance, to retreat, to demonstrate power, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was that one human, completely incapable of understanding the full scope of the empire, had somehow intruded into the only part of her mind that was meant to be untouchable. She smiled faintly, a dangerous, deliberate curve of lips, imagining the chaos he would inevitably bring into her life, and somewhere deep in the metallic hum of the city, she felt an unfamiliar, fluttering sensation that she decided not to name just yet. And somewhere in his own cabin, Elias Drake glanced up at the stars and muttered, "Well, that was weird," completely unaware that the most powerful queen in the galaxy had already started wondering how many more times he could make her laugh before the universe forced them into something neither had planned. The morning air of the Valian capital had a faint tang of ozone, as if the floating city itself had sneezed and forgotten manners. The queen's ears twitched impatiently as she watched the human fleet attempt what could generously be called a coordinated landing. Ships bobbed and weaved like drunk insects, engines sputtering in ways that would have terrified her military advisors but instead made her suppress a laugh she didn't entirely want to hide. Elias Drake, standing on the main observation deck of his flagship, looked every bit the confident hero until a misfiring gravity stabilizer sent him sliding backward into a stack of crates labeled, "Do not open, seriously." The queen's lips curved, subtly amused, and her ears flicked forward, betraying interest she had not intended to allow. The humans had been assigned to a temporary diplomatic residence, a sprawling structure that seemed to have been built by architects who either loved kaleidoscopes or had a personal vendetta against straight lines. Floors floated intermittently, walls projected moving patterns of alien flora that occasionally flickered into scenes of extinct predators, and ceiling lights hovered just out of reach unless someone grabbed a telescopic stick. Elias had spent the first hour attempting to shake hands with the furniture, mistaking a hovering console for a butler, and the queen, watching from above, found herself laughing quietly to herself. Her advisors noted the sound with horror. A queen laughing at a human was a diplomatic crisis waiting to happen, but she ignored them, ears twitching with amusement. Their next encounter was scheduled for the so-called Chamber of Understanding, a name designed to inspire hope, but built more like a labyrinth with moving walls, optical illusions, and occasional anti-gravity zones that launched unsuspecting diplomats into the ceiling. Elias arrived late as usual, tripping over the threshold and colliding with a holographic display of Valian history. "Sorry," he yelled, arms flailing. "It's a cultural appreciation." The queen raised an eyebrow, silver light flickering in her eyes as she leaned forward in her throne. "Your species has a remarkable talent for chaos," she remarked, her voice smooth but laced with humor. "I dare say it's almost strategic." Elias, confused by the praise, bowed clumsily, earning a twitch of her ears, the Valian equivalent of a suppressed smile. Diplomatic talks quickly devolved into absurdity. The translator droid, still in its chicken-like form, took every metaphor literally. When Elias said, "We come bearing good intentions," the droid announced, "they arrive with tangible handheld objects representing benevolence," prompting a startled courtier to step back, fearing attack by metaphorical kindness. The queen's lips twitched, and she allowed herself a moment of unrestrained amusement before clamping down. Even war, she mused, could benefit from occasional humor. Morale was a fragile, unpredictable thing after all. As the day wore on, necessity forced them into closer proximity. A sudden malfunction in the city's environmental shields caused an artificial storm to erupt in the diplomatic courtyard, complete with swirling rain of multicolored plasma. Elias, ever the hero or calamity, grabbed a floating umbrella, only to find it had a mind of its own and repeatedly smacked him across the face. The queen watched from the safety of her balcony, ears twitching with delight, as he batted at the rogue umbrella like a child in zero gravity. "He'll survive, won't he?" she muttered to herself, a question that was both strategic and personal. Their interactions grew strangely collaborative, often by accident. When a maintenance drone, shaped like a hovering octopus, attempted to eject Elias from the courtyard, the queen secretly redirected its programming with a subtle gesture of her hand. Elias, oblivious to the intervention, landed neatly on his feet and tipped his helmet in mock salute. "Excellent flying skills," he said to no one in particular, and the queen found herself inwardly chuckling at the absurdity. These little moments, tiny shifts in the tide of diplomacy, became the threads weaving them closer, despite all reason, duty, and interstellar protocol. Humor, it turned out, was a surprisingly effective weapon. When the humans accidentally triggered a security hologram that projected an enormous, roaring beast, Elias fumbled with the controls, panicked but trying to maintain dignity. The queen observed, bemused, as he ended up performing an impromptu interpretive dance to convince the hologram he meant no harm. By the time the beast dissolved into harmless sparks, she found herself clapping quietly. Her ears flicked again. She made a mental note to remind herself later that human charm was lethal in ways far subtler than weapons. Amid all this chaos, a private moment emerged. Elias, thinking he had finally lost all dignity, was leaning against a floating rail, trying not to drift into the ornamental fountain. The queen, descending unseen along a hidden corridor, stopped just behind him. "You do realize," she said, her voice teasing, "that in another context you would be considered a tactical liability." Elias spun around, startled, then realized it was her. "I prefer unconventional tactics," he said, with a grin that was both sheepish and infuriating. The queen's ears twitched in amusement, and for a moment neither spoke, each measuring the other with curiosity, amusement, and something more dangerous. Later, the queen returned to her chambers, her advisors fretting at her lack of focus on strategy and defense. She ignored them, pacing the length of the room, ears flicking, thoughts tangled. She could not deny that human chaos had penetrated her disciplined mind, and the thought made her both uncomfortable and strangely exhilarated. She thought about the way he had gestured, stumbled, and smiled through disaster, and she realized that emotion, entirely inconvenient and illogical, was beginning to interfere with centuries of planning. It was a delicate, dangerous thing, but also irresistible. Meanwhile, Elias in the human quarters recounted his day to his crew, who were alternately horrified and impressed by his survival rate. "I swear," he said, "that city is alive, and I think it's laughing at us." A young officer whispered, "Or it's the queen." Elias paused, considering the possibility, and for the first time imagined that perhaps the most formidable presence in the galaxy wasn't the floating city, the army, or even the weapon systems, but a woman with sharp ears and sharper eyes who could see chaos as something to be admired. He didn't know it, but she had already begun observing him with similar attention, and every misstep, every laugh, every flustered apology was weaving them together in a story neither could yet name. The day ended with the two of them in separate rooms, one pacing amid floating furniture, the other staring at the stormy skyline, both aware of each other in ways that were far more personal than protocol allowed. The queen allowed herself a small, wry smile, ears twitching in quiet approval of human unpredictability, and somewhere deep in the machinery of the floating city, she decided that the game of diplomacy had taken an unexpected turn. Humor and chaos, she realized, were as much part of strategy as shields and weapons. And human charm, she suspected, might be more dangerous than an entire fleet. The sky above the Valian capital shimmered in shades of copper and violet, a reflection of the approaching human fleet that had somehow survived more than one of the city's unpredictable anti-gravity defense mechanisms. The queen paced her chamber, her ears flicking with a rhythm that betrayed both irritation and anticipation. Today, diplomacy had to be decisive, because lingering tension had begun to unravel not only the city's equilibrium but her carefully constructed composure. She reviewed reports from her advisors, minor skirmishes along the floating outskirts, some cargo ships misdirected into the plasma storm belts, and most concerning, a rogue maintenance drone that had decided the human ambassador's quarters looked like an ideal nesting site. She pinched the bridge of her nose. It was exhausting to run an empire, but somehow managing a human was proving more chaotic than governing an entire planet. Elias Drake, standing at the helm of his ship, was no less exasperated. The Valian defenses had a sense of humor or cruelty that seemed impossible to distinguish, and now he had to coordinate the humans' final attempts at negotiation without being vaporized by a stray antimatter cannon or launched into low orbit by an errant gravity pulse. He muttered to his second-in-command, "I don't know if this is diplomacy or cosmic slapstick." The officer didn't reply, ducking as the holographic table display flickered, projecting a cartoonish octopus chasing what appeared to be an exaggerated version of Elias himself. Elias, exasperated but amused, held up his hand in mock surrender. "See, even the universe thinks I'm adorable." Their next encounter was not a formal council or the so-called Chamber of Understanding. It happened in a private observation chamber, a room designed for reflection, with a floor that hovered above nothing and a view that made the stars themselves feel intimate. Elias stumbled in, as usual, knocking a small hovering orb that promptly pinged him on the forehead. "I swear I'm becoming a human booby trap," he muttered. The queen appeared from the shadows, her ears twitching with silent amusement. "And yet you survive every time," she said, voice laced with warmth and subtle reproach. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Practice?" he offered. "Luck," she suggested. Their eyes met, and for the first time the absurdity of diplomacy gave way to something neither strategy nor humor could hide. Mutual fascination tinged with something undeniably dangerous. Chaos arrived anyway. A sudden attack on the outskirts sent shivers of panic through the city, alarms echoing across the floating spires. Elias, ever the accidental hero, found himself running down corridors that shifted beneath his feet, while the queen dispatched elite defense drones with gestures that were almost casual. At one point, Elias tripped over a security hologram projecting a colossal Valian predator, only to be caught mid-fall by a drone that was probably supposed to be neutral. "Thanks," he yelled. "You're welcome," she called back, ears flicking in a rare, involuntary laugh. Amid the calamity, the two of them moved in a coordinated dance, slipping past anti-air turrets and plasma streams as if they were partners in an interstellar ballet that neither could have rehearsed. Once the city's defenses stabilized, the queen and Elias found themselves on the uppermost spire, surrounded by a quiet broken only by the hum of distant engines. Elias, panting and bruised, turned to her. "You know, I've faced worse odds," he said, "but I've never fought alongside someone who's both terrifying and ridiculously good-looking." The queen, uncharacteristically at a loss, flicked her ears. "Flattery will not save you," she said, though her voice softened. "But perhaps it might," she added, allowing a small smile to curve her lips. In that moment, the political, the strategic, and the absurd all collided, and she realized that she was no longer thinking about victory or defeat in the conventional sense. She was thinking about him, about this human who had turned chaos into charm, destruction into humor, and diplomacy into something unexpectedly personal. The humans were allowed to remain in the capital under strict supervision, a truce forged not by treaties alone, but by the unspoken acknowledgement of trust and mutual respect, heavily salted with humor to keep everyone sane. Elias adapted to the city's quirks, learning to dodge floating furniture, navigate shifting floors, and survive occasional plasma showers while maintaining his irrepressible charm. The queen, for her part, discovered that governing was more than giving orders. It was about reading nuances, about bending rules with subtlety, and most dangerously, about allowing oneself to feel when one had been trained to suppress all unnecessary emotion. She realized she had changed. She could still be ruthless when needed, but she had discovered the value of levity, spontaneity, and, unthinkably, the faint thrill of caring for someone she should have regarded as an adversary. Their private interactions grew bolder. In one memorable instance, Elias accidentally triggered a maintenance protocol that caused the queen's favorite holographic garden to overflow with neon fish that immediately began chasing her advisors. She blinked at him, ears twitching, and instead of scolding him, she laughed, a pure, unrestrained sound that made her advisors freeze in shock. "You have a talent for destruction," she said, "and a remarkable ability to amuse me while doing it." Elias grinned. "It's a gift," he said. Their banter, dangerous and witty, became a bridge across cultures, species, and the unspoken tension of forbidden affection. Eventually, the queen made her decision. She summoned Elias to the Chamber of Reflection, a space where time and gravity seemed to bend to the will of the observer. "I confess," she said, her voice low, "that I find myself unreasonably invested in your survival." Elias, ever literal and occasionally hopeless at subtlety, blinked. "You mean you like me?" He stumbled, flustered, but his grin never faded. The queen allowed herself a small nod, her ears flicking in a manner that was both shy and deliberate. "I like many things," she said, "but you are an anomaly." He laughed, a bright, unsteady sound, and she realized she could not imagine a galaxy in which he was absent. The resolution came quietly. The fleets remained at a standstill, but the humans were no longer prisoners. They were allies, though the precise definition of ally varied wildly depending on which side one asked. The queen, now aware of her capacity for both humor and affection, began introducing reforms, using Elias' presence to demonstrate the value of unconventional thinking. Elias, for his part, had grown from a reckless captain to someone who understood that survival sometimes required patience, creativity, and a willingness to admire chaos when it carried a certain charm. Their connection, improbable as it was, became the foundation for a new era, one where diplomacy, humor, and unpredictable affection could be as potent as any weapon. In the quiet that followed, the queen and Elias stood together on a balcony, looking out at a galaxy that seemed just slightly smaller, slightly more manageable, because they had learned to face it side by side. She flicked her ears, he adjusted his helmet, and they shared